Max wins number 3, the Mercedes collide, and Piastri proves himself this weekend in Qatar. So I asked you for your hottest takes from the 2023 Qatar Grand Prix, and they were even hotter than Fernando Alonso's seat. Starting off with one of my own, I'm going to say that this will be the best season of Max Verstappen's career and go down as one of the greatest of all time, because again, it was another dominant display come Sunday for Max Verstappen. It's just something that we've become accustomed to, where he is comfortably clear of the rest of the field, especially after Hamilton and Russell took each other out, which we'll get onto. But he was just so far ahead of everybody else, and it was another pole position, another victory, and another world championship in the bag for Max Verstappen. And the reason I say that this will go down as his best season is I genuinely don't know what he has to do to be better than this, like apart from win every single Grand Prix, because there are 5 races left this season. I could honestly see him winning all 5 of those, and then that is just an obscene amount of wins. To only miss out on 3 victories in a 22 race season is just phenomenal. Unnamed says Norris would have challenged Verstappen if he didn't bottle quali, and let's address the first part of that in particular, in that McLaren were actually second best this weekend and actually looked like they could have caused Red Bull a headache. Like, we haven't seen that at all this season, really. Red Bull have been so far ahead of the rest of the field, and to say that McLaren could have even been close is an incredible compliment to where that team have put their car this season. Like, they have achieved so much in such a short amount of time as well with that McLaren car, and if they can keep that momentum going, they'll actually be in the conversation for victories next season and maybe be the closest competitor to Max Verstappen for those titles. So McLaren actually coming in, actually managed the fastest pit stop this weekend as well, a record that they've taken off Red Bull. Maybe that's the first step. They take the pit stop record off Red Bull. Now they're going to start taking some victories off Red Bull and keep this ball rolling. The final meowt down, what an excellent name. Everyone who isn't Andrea Stella or Zach Brown is now shitting themselves over the kid in car 81. And I couldn't agree more. Oscar Piastri is on fire right now. Winning the sprint race on the Saturday sets a real mark in the sand for him, but then also capitalizing off the madness at the start, jumping from 6th place to 2nd place and holding on to that 2nd place in the race was really impressive as well. Okay, maybe it could have been 3rd if Norris was allowed to attack. Maybe, if Norris was in a Mercedes car, that would have been a slightly different race, but even so, it laid down a huge marker for Oscar Piastri and showed that he is the real deal. Like, his mentality for a rookie is incredible. His pace is improving every single race, and it's scary that he's only 17 races into his career. Alvaro says Lando Norris doesn't have the mentality to win a championship. We saw in Sochi when he bottled a race win, and in the Qatar sprint, when he gets into race winning pressure, he crumbles. And I think this is a little bit harsh on Lando Norris, but I can completely see where you're coming from, because there have been a few weekends. You mentioned Sochi this weekend, Spa and Imola in 2021 come to my mind as well, where he's had a car that's looked really, really good and the pressure has been on him to perform, and he's maybe pushed it just slightly over the limit. I think Lando Norris and Charles Leclerc are in a similar boat at this moment in time for me right now, where sometimes the both of them push really, really hard and they just exceed the limit and they don't quite get the most out of the car for that weekend. Like Lando Norris, for me, it was qualifying actually, where he qualified in 10th place, but should have probably been on the front row of the grid because he had the pace there, but just kept pushing the car a little bit too far and kept breaking those track limits. And with Piastri doing well, it does put more pressure on Lando to perform. Obviously, Oscar getting the first win of his career. Obviously, it was a sprint race, but Lando Norris still without a victory in Formula One. The pressure is starting to mount. And as much as the McLaren team have a really good driver lineup right now, in the fact that they've got 2 young drivers that are both hungry to get the most out of that car every single weekend, it's going to get to a point where, similar to what we're seeing with Mercedes, who we'll touch on in a second, you've got 2 drivers in there, they both want to be the number 1, and there isn't a clear number 1 spot for either of them. And Lando Norris still has the advantage right now, but in another 20 races time, next season, when we get towards the end, is Oscar Piastri going to be closing in on Lando Norris? We'll have to wait and see, but the pressure is on Lando Norris to outperform his teammate. The pressure is not on Oscar Piastri to somehow be amazing and be better than Lando Norris already. Polish Eddie says, we have witnessed Hamilton's wheel-to-wheel ability dwindle over the last couple of years. And I can see where you're coming from, actually, because Hamilton has definitely thrown away a great opportunity here, but it did also have shades of the clash that he had with Alonso in Spa, where, again, they just had all the room on the outside, but didn't actually use it. Although I suppose it was similar to the Ocon, Hulkenberg and Perez incident that happened in the sprint, where 3 cars just don't go into one corner, and maybe Lewis Hamilton was trying to squeeze George and didn't know that Verstappen was actually on the other side of George, so George had absolutely nowhere to go. And it's likely that even if he would have got into the lead, he wouldn't have gone on to win the Grand Prix because Max Verstappen was just so quick. But it was a big chance to score points over Sergio Perez and close the gap to second place in the driver's standings, which is absolutely huge for Lewis Hamilton. And I agree, he doesn't really have anyone to blame but himself. And then Polish Eddie expanded, saying Team LH blaming George for the Turn 1 incident is delusion and tunnel vision at its peak. I mean, even Lewis Hamilton came out, held his hands up and said that it was his fault, but Mercedes have a huge problem, I think, with Lewis Hamilton, George Russell and their two fan bases because they're already going at each other all of the time right now, and they've just offered both drivers a 2-year extension to their contract. So over that 2 years, I can only see this getting worse and worse between the two of them. And at the moment, they're only battling for second in the constructors' standings and the occasional podium finish. If this was for wins, this is like Nico Rosberg, Lewis Hamilton all over again, but possibly to an even bigger scale because George Russell is supposed to be the successor to Lewis Hamilton, and he isn't quite being that right now. And Lewis Hamilton in no way is going to step aside and let George be that. So we've got 2 more years of the Mercedes drivers battling and bashing heads basically every single Grand Prix. And on that note, Nathan then added, George is desperate to prove that he should be the number 1 at Mercedes. Whilst the incident was not his fault, notice all the comments on the radio this weekend of him being critical of Lewis and trying to prove his capability of managing his own race. And we have to say that George Russell did put together a really good race. Obviously, dropping back to last and then coming out 4th was very, very impressive and just showed how much pace the Mercedes car did have this weekend. But I feel like George has had a little bit of a reality check this season in that getting the better of Lewis Hamilton over the course of a season takes so much work. Obviously, he's not quite replaced Lewis Hamilton as that number 1 yet, but I think he was expecting to be that number 1 at Mercedes by this point, and maybe there was talk of that. Obviously, when he was still at Williams, they were saying, don't worry, you're going to be the number 1, you're going to be the number 1. He's now come into the Mercedes. He's not getting the victories that he was probably promised because the Mercedes car isn't quite where it was before, and also he hasn't displaced Lewis Hamilton, and even though he beat him in the championship last year, the circumstances were so different, and he is a great driver, but I completely agree, he's desperate to try and just show something that he isn't quite capable of yet, and also he's desperate to get performances out of the Mercedes car that the Mercedes car can't offer him right now. Dane says, how ironic that Aston Martin are only 11 points ahead of McLaren, despite McLaren not being great at the start of the season. Aston Martin are definitely in a position where the second half of the season has just seen them slip further and further off the pace. But it didn't help this weekend in particular that Fernando Alonso sent the car into the gravel a couple of times, which was really uncharacteristically sloppy. And then Lance Stroll, it looked like he was going to get his first points finish since Belgium, where he finished in 9th place. And then he broke track limits, obviously got that 10-second penalty and dropped out of the points. So the car wasn't there for them, but the drivers also had a really bad weekend in Qatar. So it was a complete Aston Martin collapse for the entire weekend, and the car definitely isn't where it once was. I think we do have to remember that obviously if we take maybe 8 or 9 races into the season, we're now having another 8 or 9 races of the season, and McLaren have been the much better car in that second half, where Aston Martin were the much better car in the first half. So it kind of makes sense that they're fairly equal on points. I think the difference, though, is that Lance Stroll is nowhere near the level of Oscar Piastri, and Lance Stroll lashing out on the Friday doesn't help when the feeling around the team is quite negative right now. Chaos says, Joe driver of the day for me, even though I'm a McLaren fan, getting from P19 to P9 in an Alfa. It was Alfa Romeo's biggest result since 2022 at the Canadian Grand Prix, so it was incredible to see both of the Alfa Romeos in the points and jumped above Haas in the constructor standings this weekend as well. And actually, both drivers had great weekends throughout. I know that qualifying was really tricky for them. They clearly didn't have the qualifying pace, but when it came to the race and managing those tyres, where we had the lots of tyre changes throughout the Grand Prix, they did really, really well. And Alfa Romeo often go under the radar because their drivers aren't insanely bad or insanely good. They're kind of in that middle ground where they're just good enough to be in Formula One, but we don't talk about them being the greatest drivers ever. But this weekend, both drivers deserve their flowers. I thought Valtteri Bottas was really, really good throughout the entire weekend, did really good in the sprint as well, and then Zhou Guanyu definitely came to life in the race. And now, with 5 races to go, can they hold on to 8th place in the Constructors? And then maybe, especially because Mexico is one of those races where Alfa Romeo seem to do really well as well, maybe they're pushing for 7th place and Williams' 7th place is suddenly under pressure, especially because Williams only have Alex Albon as a driver capable of scoring points, whereas Alfa Romeo, both drivers seem capable of scoring points this season. Mikey says the tyre mileage limit made for better racing, a track that didn't promise much racing to begin with. There was no tedious tyre management, just flat out stints. And I completely agree, it definitely worked for this track and opens up the conversation around tyres once again, especially considering some races earlier on in the season, we've seen the like 0 stop strategy work quite well. I'm thinking Esteban Ocon in Baku is the one that comes to my mind, mainly because he nearly killed some journalists in the pit lane, but also because he managed to do that entire race on one set of tyres and looked fairly comfortable on them as well. Whereas this, it was kind of a little bit artificial, and I'm not sure about artificially making the lap limit 18 or different for different circuits on the calendar, but maybe adding more compulsory stops might be a good idea. I've always thought about the fact that obviously they have to do 1 stop and use 2 different tyre compounds, but maybe we make it compulsory that they have to do 2 stops and use all 3 tyre compounds at some point in the race. I just feel like that would add a little bit more strategy and a little bit more fun. Pine Desert Sports, F1 needs to start having races at more historic tracks and tracks near people rather than holding races in the middle of the desert. I think after a weekend like this, a really good point to bring up, because my main problem with tracks like this being added to the calendar is they don't work for the cars and they don't work for the drivers. Like the MotoGP track that we saw this weekend in Qatar just completely disintegrated the Formula 1 tyres, so the cars don't work, and then also the drivers don't work inside the car because they're completely overheating even though the race is being held in the middle of the night. Like Ocon was throwing up in his helmet, Sargeant had to come to a stop, Lance Stroll talked about the fact that he was passing out inside the Aston Martin car as well, and these are athletes at the absolute pinnacle of their performance. They are the fittest people that you will ever meet in your life, and they can't actually get to the end of the Grand Prix without suffering real problems, and that just can't be a thing that happens. Thank you guys so much for watching and for all of your support on the channel recently. We have grown exponentially in the last few months and I cannot thank you enough. And if you enjoyed this video, I also put together this video here which I think you'll enjoy too, so click that link and I'll see you over there.